The courthouse sat at the edge of a quiet Wyoming town, the kind of place where time didn't rush and neither did the people. It had stood for nearly a century, built with stone and timber long before email or electric gates. The floors creaked with each step, and the wooden benches had worn smooth under decades of small-town disputes and hushed decisions. Most days it handles paperwork more than people do, land boundaries, livestock complaints, water rights. But on that particular morning, something different settled in the air. Not tension exactly, more like expectation, the way the wind changes just before a storm. No one knew why. Not yet. Chuck Norris had arrived before anyone else. He parked his old truck 3 blocks down, like he always did. He wasn't one for parking in front of places, not when you could take your time and walk. There was a rhythm to his steps, steady, unhurried, the kind of pace that didn't demand attention but earned it anyway. He was 83 now. The years had made his voice quieter, but his presence stronger. Not from fame, but from the kind of stillness that made people instinctively lower their voices when he entered a room. He wasn't here to make a scene. He wasn't here to fight. At least not the way people expected from someone with his name. In the crook of his arm was a weathered leather case. Inside a folded letter, an old military cap, and a copy of a land plat that no one in the county office seemed to remember filing. His boots were clean, his shirt buttoned, and his eyes, though lined by time, were calm. That's what people always remembered about Chuck, the stillness. As if the storms had passed through him long ago and left him anchored. The case today wasn't dramatic, at least not on the surface. It was about a parcel of land, half an acre, just past the West Creek. Once forgotten, now suddenly valuable. A development firm had filed for rights to expand their new luxury retreat into that area, claiming the land was improperly zoned and had been left unregistered for over 20 years. But Chuck knew differently. That land wasn't just soil and survey lines. It was where he'd buried his closest friend. A makeshift memorial under a cottonwood tree, marked by a cross hand-carved from scrap pine. There was no plaque, no ceremony, just silence, and a name he hadn't spoken out loud in years. The friend was a fellow soldier, one of those stories people don't ask about because they're afraid of the answer. Chuck had built the memorial himself, paid taxes on the property out of pocket, maintained the area by hand, and never said a word to anyone about it because it wasn't for show. It was for memory and respect. And the claim from the developers came through. It felt more than wrong. It felt like an erasure, as if something sacred could be priced, renamed, paved. At first, Chuck considered letting it go. After all, he didn't like courts, he didn't like noise, and he definitely didn't like having to explain things that should have been obvious. But one morning, he found a notice tacked to the fence by the tree. Final warning. Remove all personal property or face removal by enforcement. And something in him changed. Not anger, not outrage, resolve. He knew he wouldn't yell, he wouldn't beg, he would speak. Once, calmly, and that would be enough. By the time the bailiff unlocked the courthouse doors, a handful of townspeople had gathered on the steps. Some were just curious. Others had heard rumors. Chuck didn't look at them. He just nodded politely and walked inside, choosing a seat near the front. No lawyer, no papers are spread out. Just the leather case on the floor by his feet and his hands resting on his knees. The judge that morning was new, young, appointed just last year. Her name was Jennifer Harland. Sharp suit, sharp tone, known for keeping things moving and not indulging what she called emotional storytelling. She glanced briefly at the docket and barely reacted to the name. She asked for opening statement. The development firm's attorney stood quickly, polished, confident, voice crisp like it had been trained in debate clubs and Ivy League halls. He explained the company's plans, the economic benefits, The clean documentation showed that the land had no confirmed owner. He said it all with that professional sympathy people use when they're pretending not to condescend. Then it was Chuck's turn. He stood slowly, not because he was weak, but because he didn't like to rush through things that mattered. When he spoke, the room grew still, not out of obligation, out of instinct. He said he had something to share. Not a document, a letter. Not from a notary, but from a man no longer alive. He reached into the case and pulled it out, carefully, as if it might fall apart in his hands. Then he held it up. This, he said, was written in 1972. It had been sealed in a Bible for 5 decades. It was from someone Judge Harland knew, even if she didn't realize it yet. At that, people in the gallery shifted. He unfolded the letter gently, smoothing the creases. There was no drama in his voice, no rise, no theatrical pause, just the kind of quiet that draws you in, because you know the next sentence might change something. He read the opening line. "To whoever stands in my place should I not return." That was how it started. The letter was from General William Harland, decorated veteran, founder of the very foundation funding the luxury retreat, and the father of the presiding judge. Chuck stopped reading and looked up, not at her, but at the flag behind her bench. He said the general had written this in case of his death in Vietnam. He'd asked that if Chuck Norris ever returned home and wanted anything preserved, anything at all, it should be done. No questions, no review, just trust. Chuck paused again, let the silence do what his voice never tried to. Then he said the last line of the letter, not looking at the judge, but at the cottonwood tree in his memory. "Honor the man who never asked for thanks, for he gave me back my life." The room didn't breathe. The judge blinked. Her posture stiffened. Her name still hung on that letter like a quiet burden. Chuck placed the letter on the clerk's table and sat back down. He didn't say anything else. Because he didn't need to. The power of what he said wasn't in the words themselves, but in how he carried them. No anger, no blame, just presence. His presence built over decades of choosing restraint over noise, discipline over reaction, and dignity over drama. For a moment, no one moved. The attorney for the developers stared blankly, as if all the legal logic in the world had suddenly collapsed under the weight of one quiet truth. Respect doesn't come from being heard the loudest. It comes from speaking only when it counts, and meaning every word. The silence that followed Chuck's words didn't feel like awkwardness, it felt like reverence. The kind of stillness that only happens when people realize they've been standing too close to something sacred without knowing it. Judge Harland glanced at the letter resting on the edge of her bench. Her expression didn't change much, but something in her shoulders did. A small drop, barely noticeable, the way someone exhales when they remember something personal. She didn't reach for the letter. Not yet. Her fingers tapped lightly on the wood. A habit of control. But for once she didn't speak. The courtroom had shifted. The tension that had been there when Chuck entered had dissolved into something else. Respect, maybe. Or humility. Not the kind you declare, the kind that sneaks up on you when you've misjudged someone and suddenly know it. The development attorney tried to recover. He cleared his throat, shuffled a few papers, and spoke about zoning regulations, about procedural filings, about how letters written 50 years ago couldn't carry legal weight in a present-day claim. But his voice lacked the certainty it had before. It sounded mechanical now, as if even he knew the argument had lost its ground. Chuck didn't react. He didn't argue back. He sat still, eyes steady, hands folded over one knee. That was the thing about him. He didn't need to take control of a room. He just needed to show up fully in it. Presence is a funny kind of power. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't perform. It doesn't even ask permission. But when it's real, it's felt. Deeply, by everyone. Judge Harland finally addressed the room. Her tone was more measured this time, less clipped. She acknowledged the emotional nature of the testimony. She reminded everyone that while personal accounts were moving, legal ownership required documentation. And then she asked a question that caught everyone off guard. She wanted to know who else had known about the land, who had seen Chuck tending it, who could speak not from paperwork, but from memory. Chuck turned slightly, not to answer, but to look toward the gallery. He didn't say a word, he didn't have to. An older man in the back stood. Slowly, carefully. His name was David Klein, local, retired postmaster. He said he'd seen Chuck out there every Memorial Day for the last 20 years, rain or shine, cleaning the memorial, leaving flowers, sitting quietly, sometimes for hours. He said the land had always felt like it belonged to him, not because of offense or deed, but because of how he treated it. The woman next to him added her voice. Sandra Mullins, teacher, said her students used to take field trips past that spot, called it the quiet field, said they knew to stay silent, walking by, out of respect, not because someone told them to, but because they felt it. More people spoke, not loud, not with flourish, just with sincerity. Slowly the courtroom was filled with testimony not of legal terms, but of lived experience, of presence, of stewardship, of what it means to care for something even when no one's watching. That's when the dynamic shifted again. Because influence doesn't always come from the one standing at the podium, sometimes it rises from the quiet agreement of those who've witnessed integrity over time. The judge asked Chuck if he had any formal documentation of ownership. He nodded once. Then, I reached into the leather case again and removed a folded sheet of paper. It was a tax receipt, paid in cash, dated 10 years prior, hand-stamped, initialed by a clerk who'd long since retired. It wasn't enough to establish a full title, but it was enough to cast doubt on the developer's claim of abandonment. The attorney objected, said the document wasn't in the system, said it didn't matter. But the room had already decided that it did. What people underestimate about influence is that it's rarely about proving people wrong. It's about reminding them what's right. Chuck hadn't come to argue, he'd come to reveal. And revelation, when delivered calmly, has a way of disarming even the most polished opposition. The judge recessed the court for a short break. People stood and stretched, but they didn't leave. They whispered quietly, exchanging glances. Some looked at Chuck, others looked at the empty seat beside him, as if imagining the friend buried beneath that tree. Chuck stayed seated. He wasn't interested in the whispers. He watched the light filter through the old windows and drank water from a bottle he pulled from his coat pocket. Outside, a local reporter had started live streaming short updates, not because it was dramatic, but because something real was happening. People were watching from nearby towns. A few even drove in during the recess, not to protest, just to witness. By the time the court resumed, word had begun to spread, not in headlines, in phone calls, in quiet texts between friends, something about Chuck's voice, the letter, the memorial. It all felt like a moment bigger than a property dispute. The judge opened the second half of the hearing with more formality. She acknowledged the unusual nature of the case. She confirmed that due to the newly surfaced tax document and the conflicting testimonies, further verification would be required. But then she addressed Chuck directly. She asked why he had never come forward with the letter before, why he'd stayed quiet for so long. Chuck looked up slowly. His voice didn't rise. He said it was because the letter wasn't written for the court, it was written for character. And character, once spoken too often, becomes performance. He said he brought it now not because he wanted to win, but because silence had been mistaken for weakness, and he wasn't going to let a man's memory be erased just because he'd chosen quiet over attention. That answer stayed in the air long after he finished. You could feel people shift in their seats, not because they were uncomfortable, because they were absorbing the weight of what had just been said. True communication isn't about talking more. It's about speaking from a place that can't be faked. The judge nodded. Slowly. Then I asked the final question of the day. She wanted to know who had written the initials on the tax slip. Chuck replied that he didn't know the man's full name, just called him Pete. Worked at the county office part-time, drove a blue truck, smoked too much, had a limp. Always wore a bolo tie. Someone in the room whispered. Another person laughed softly in recognition. Then from the side gallery, a hand went up. It was a woman in her 70s. Said her brother Pete had passed away 5 years ago. But that was his stamp, and that was his signature. She recognized both. The room fell still again. Because the truth, when it's real, doesn't always need a podium. It just needs one person willing to say they saw it too. The judge recessed for the day, promised a full review, promised fairness. But the decision had already begun taking shape. Not in the courtroom papers, in the court of public conscience. Chuck stood, gathered his things, and nodded to the clerk. No celebration, no applause, just a quiet acknowledgement. Because dignity doesn't need a microphone. It only needs presence. And for many in that room, that day, they walked out changed, not because of a verdict, but because they had seen what communication could look like when it came from depth, not performance, from memory, not tactics. And from a man who had spent a lifetime learning the value of saying less, but meaning more. ChatGPT said. By the next morning, the story had already started moving beyond the courtroom, not because anyone tried to make it go viral, but because some things travel fast when they're real. A photo of the folded letter on the judge's bench made its way onto a local newspaper's front page. The headline was quiet but powerful. A man brings a memory instead of a lawyer. The town started to notice. At first, it was just a few conversations over breakfast counters. People ask each other if they know about Chuck's letter. Suppose they remembered the man buried under the cottonwood tree. But then the calls started. A reporter from a statewide paper asked for a comment. Chuck declined. A retired colonel in Texas sent an email to the county clerk's office offering testimony on Chuck's service and integrity. A former student from the town's high school posted a video online about walking past that tree every spring, feeling something sacred in the stillness. By afternoon, local radio picked it up. They didn't tell it like breaking news, they told it like folklore, the kind that's lived more than it's told, the kind that feels like a shared memory, even if you weren't there. And people started remembering things. A mechanic mentioned how Chuck once showed up to help sandbag a neighbor's barn before a flood without being asked. A nurse recalled him quietly paying for a family's medicine bill at the pharmacy, leaving no name. Stories surfaced. Not dramatic, but consistent. Small gestures of quiet character. The development company didn't say much. Their PR office released a short statement that read more like damage control than clarity. They insisted the land filing was part of a larger initiative and not personal, but by then the town had already decided it was. Because when people feel something's been taken from someone who never asked for attention, they tend to care more. The courtroom wasn't scheduled again for 2 more days, but the building didn't stay quiet. A few folks started gathering outside, not to protest, just to show up. Some brought coffee. Others just stood for a while, then left. A few brought small flags and planted them quietly near the steps. No signs, no speeches, just presence. That same presence Chuck had carried into the room. On the second day, something changed. A woman in her early 30s showed up with a worn backpack and a determined look. Her name was Emma Torres. She introduced herself as a civil liberties attorney, but more importantly as the daughter of a man Chuck had once carried out of a downed helicopter in 1971. She had read the transcript online, found the name of the memorial field, drove 5 hours overnight, and she had one offer. She said she wanted to represent Chuck pro bono, not for credit, for alignment. Chuck was polite. He listened. He asked one question. He wanted to know if she had ever stood up when it was easier to sit down. She said yes. Then told him about a case where she'd defended a school janitor who was fired for speaking Spanish to a grieving mother. Chuck didn't say anything at first. Then he nodded and handed her the folded tax slip from his case file. That moment wasn't loud, but for Emma, it felt like the clearest yes she'd ever received. The courthouse clerk added her to the case file, and suddenly Chuck wasn't standing alone anymore. Not that he had ever needed to, but now someone would carry part of the weight. And that meant something. Word of Emma's involvement spread quickly, not because she was famous, but because people love when legacy meets purpose. Her father, Miguel Torres, had written about Chuck in his journal after the war. The entry surfaced online and was shared by Emma with permission. It read simply, "He never told me to be brave. He just stood still when I needed someone to stay." That one line made its way onto social media posts, pinned on bulletin boards, and even written in chalk outside the courthouse steps. Reporters began circling, but not for scandal, for the story. They asked about Chuck's background, his medals, his films. But every time, people shifted the conversation back to the memorial field, to the cottonwood tree, to the idea that maybe respect wasn't earned through sound, but through stillness, and that maybe that's what had been missing. One late afternoon, a group of veterans showed up. Not to talk, just to stand near the fence by the west field. They didn't speak. They saluted. Then left. The next morning, the news cameras arrived. At first, it looked like they'd overwhelmed the town, but something in the air kept them honest. A cameraman from a national network lowered his lens at one point, looked around, and said he hadn't seen this kind of silence in years. Not apathy, reverence. Back at the farmhouse, Chuck wasn't watching the coverage. He was feeding horses, tightening fence wires, reading old letters on the porch while the wind stirred leaves across the dirt road. Emma visited twice that day, once to update him on filings, once just to sit. She noticed he kept a small wooden box beside his chair. Inside were coins, photos, and a piece of a dog tag. She asked about it. He said it wasn't for remembering, it was for staying grounded. There's a difference. Remembering can make you live in the past. Staying grounded reminds you who you are while you move forward. That line stayed with her long after she left. By the time the court resumed on Monday, the gallery was full, not rowdy, focused, quiet. Farmers sat beside lawyers, teenagers beside veterans, journalists beside teachers, everyone watching. Not just Chuck, the judge, the process, the way influence might move when it has nothing to prove. Emma rose to speak first. She didn't raise her voice, didn't bring charts or slides. She opened with a single sentence. Influence is not volume, it's clarity over time. Then she paused and let the room breathe. She submitted new evidence. A signed affidavit from the retired county clerk verifying Pete's initials on the tax slip. A notarized statement from the man who sold Chuck the parcel in 1992 confirmed it was a handshake deal, followed by a quiet payment. The clerk had processed it as a cash entry, but it was never digitized. The paper trail existed, but it is not in the systems most people use today. Then Emma handed the judge a folded document. A letter, signed by General Harland in 1972, formally requested that the land surrounding the memorial be preserved in honor of service. It had never been filed officially. It had been tucked in the back of a military journal, and it bore his seal. The judge took her time reading. The room was silent. The opposing attorney stood to challenge its relevance. He argued that the letter wasn't a legal instruction, that it had no official standing, that it was sentiment, not substance. Emma responded by reading the final sentence of the letter aloud. "If my name ever holds any weight, let it be used to shield the one who stood beside me when mine meant nothing." That line stopped the air, not because of its poetry, because of its truth. Then Chuck stood. He didn't hold anything, didn't point or gesture, just spoke. He said he had never needed protection, never asked for praise. All he wanted was for a man's memory to remain where it belonged, on that soil, by that tree, in peace. Then he looked at the judge and said one last thing. Silence isn't absence, it's presence without decoration. And he sat down. Nobody clapped, nobody moved. Because sometimes the most powerful voice in the room doesn't rise, it grounds. At that moment, everyone understood why the man so often seen as a warrior had become something else entirely. A witness to dignity, to memory, to influence is born not of fear, but of stillness. And the story was no longer his alone, it had become everyone's. The courthouse was never built for moments like this. It had been designed for land deeds, parking disputes, and the occasional family hearing. But on that day, it held something heavier. Not drama, not theatrics, something quieter, a kind of reckoning. People had lined up before sunrise. Some came from towns Chuck had never been to, others had driven through the night from nearby states. No banners, no chants, just steady footsteps and early light. By the time the clerk unlocked the doors, the line wrapped around the square. Inside, there wasn't a single empty seat. Emma arrived just after 7. She didn't walk in like a lawyer about to argue. She moved like someone carrying something personal. Her bag was light, but her shoulders were not. She stopped to shake hands with the clerk, nodded to the bailiff, then sat next to Chuck. He greeted her with a simple nod and handed her a folded napkin with 2 thermoses, 1 black coffee, 1 mint tea. She smiled, said nothing. Sometimes, the most important conversations don't need words. At exactly 8, Judge Harland entered. Her robe looked the same, her posture is still sharp, but her face had changed, less guarded, less sure. She looked out at the full courtroom and paused, not for control, for breath. She called the court to order. Her voice was steady, but the pause between words told its own story. The attorney for the development firm rose. This time, he didn't launch into confident openings. He cleared his throat, adjusted his tie, and asked for a procedural clarification. The courtroom wasn't buying it. Not because he was wrong, but because his timing was. The room had already shifted into something else, something slower, more human. Emma stood. Her voice didn't fill the room with volume, it filled it with presence. She requested that the court recognize new evidence not as a technicality but as context. She said it wasn't just about land ownership anymore. It was about intent, stewardship, and the legacy left in quiet acts that aren't always documented but never forgotten. She referenced the affidavit signed by the original seller, a man named Donald Briggs, who was now living in a senior care facility just outside Cheyenne. He had confirmed the sale, identified Chuck in a photo, and described the transaction in full detail. A notarized statement had been added to the case file. There was no official deed filed, but the man's memory was crystal clear. Next, Emma presented a surveyor's map from 1992, hand-drawn but signed, showing the boundary lines, as Chuck had kept them for over 3 decades. The map had been folded and tucked behind a filing cabinet in the county records office. It had dust marks and a small coffee stain in the corner, but it was real. Then she paused. She looked at the judge and said something that made every person in the room straighten just slightly. She said this case wasn't about whether Chuck Norris had dotted every legal I or crossed every regulatory T. It was about whether integrity could still carry weight when it didn't come wrapped in red tape. She asked the court to consider what it meant when a man who asked for nothing brought forward everything. The judge nodded, slowly. She took the papers, reviewed the map, and then asked a question of her own, not to Emma, to Chuck. She asked what he had done all those years when no one was watching, when the land was quiet and the tree stood alone. Chuck looked at her, no tension in his jaw, no fire behind his eyes. Just time. Worn smooth like river stones. He said he kept the grass low, replaced the cross when the wind took it down, left a folded flag on every birthday, and talked to the tree once a year when nobody else was around. That was all. The courtroom was still. It wasn't sadness that filled the space. It was something quieter, something heavier, a kind of shared respect that couldn't be demanded, only felt. The judge then turned to the development attorney. She asked if his client had any personal connection to the land, any memory of it, any reason to believe it was abandoned other than an outdated system. He answered truthfully. He said no. Then something unexpected happened. A hand was raised in the gallery. The judge hesitated. She wasn't used to spontaneous voices during proceedings, but something in the moment felt different. She nodded. An elderly woman stood. She wore a soft grey coat and carried a small envelope in her hand. She said she was Pete's sister, the same Pete whose initials were on the tax slip. She had found an old receipt in his belongings after he passed, one that matched Chuck's. Same date, same note in the margin, paid in full, no further action. She walked forward slowly and handed it to the clerk, then returned to her seat without another word. The room absorbed her presence like a page being turned without a sound. Emma didn't speak. She didn't need to. The silence was more persuasive than anything she could have prepared. The judge recessed for an hour. During that break, people didn't go outside. They stayed, talking in low voices, sharing quiet nods. Nobody checked their phones. Nobody cared about the usual. The story wasn't just legal anymore. It had become moral. Chuck sat still the whole time, legs crossed, fingers resting lightly on the arm of his chair. He watched the sunlight shift across the wooden floor. He wasn't watching for an outcome. He was remembering something older than the courtroom itself. When the judge returned, the courtroom stood. She sat slowly, looked around, and said the case would continue under full review, but would no longer proceed under the assumption of abandonment or misconduct. She said the court had sufficient evidence of ongoing stewardship and historical intent. Then she said something that no one expected.
She admitted she had never fully understood the weight of silence, that growing up she was taught to speak up, assert, and debate. But watching Chuck had reminded her that sometimes influence lives in restraint, that clarity doesn't shout, it stands. There was no verdict yet, no ruling, but that moment became the turning point. Chuck nodded once, not as a reaction, as a marker, like something had landed and he'd seen it. And the courtroom, for once, let the moment be. Later that afternoon, as the crowd slowly left the courthouse, the conversations were different. People weren't talking about legal arguments or court procedures. They were talking about tone, about timing. Chuck said so little, but somehow everything important was communicated. It wasn't just about the land anymore. It was about how he carried himself in the face of a challenge. In the parking lot, a man in a pressed white shirt approached Emma. He had a network badge clipped to his collar and a voice trained for cameras. He asked if Chuck would be available for a short interview, said it could help his case, could build pressure, could swing public opinion. Emma looked at him with a kind of calm firmness that didn't reject him, but redirected him. She said Chuck wasn't looking to win with noise. He was here to stand with clarity, and clarity didn't need a microphone. The man jotted something in a notepad, nodded politely, and walked away.
Inside the courthouse, the judge remained at her bench longer than usual, not to review documents, just to think. There are moments in a career when the rules are clear, but the right thing feels bigger than the statute. That day, she sat with both. Chuck didn't linger. He stepped out into the light and walked with the same steady pace that had brought him in. A few people approached him with kind words. He responded with nods and a few quiet thank yous. Someone tried to hand him a small box of homemade cookies. He accepted them with a smile and said they'd go great with coffee. He never tried to be impressive, he just showed up with nothing to prove. That night, at a local diner just off the main road, a group of veterans gathered around a corner table. The usual banter was quieter than normal. They spoke about the hearing, about the way Chuck stood, about how he never interrupted, never defended, just placed the truth on the table like an old friend and let it speak. One of them, a former Marine named Terry, said he wished he had learned earlier that silence isn't weakness, it's a choice, a tool. He said too many people confused talking with communicating. But Chuck reminded them that stillness could echo longer than sound. A young waitress overheard the conversation. Later that night, she posted a short message on her page. She wrote that a man walked into court today without raising his voice and still made everyone feel something they hadn't felt in a long time. Respect. That post got shared, not because it was viral, because it was true. By the next morning, calls started coming in to the county office, not from lawyers or officials, from people who wanted to know where the cottonwood tree was. Some asked if they could visit. Others just wanted to send a letter. A woman from Minnesota offered to donate a bench for visitors to sit and reflect. A former judge in Oregon mailed a letter addressed simply to the man who reminded us, care of the courthouse. Chuck didn't know about most of it. He didn't own a smartphone. His internet worked when the wind didn't blow too hard. He spent the next day fixing a hinge on his barn door. When Emma dropped by with updates, he asked only two things: whether the field had stayed quiet and whether the judge had seemed rushed. Emma smiled and said the silence was respected, and the judge looked like she was thinking more than speaking. Chuck nodded once, then poured her coffee. She asked if he ever got nervous speaking in court. He looked at her, almost puzzled, then said no. He got nervous when people listened only to respond, not when they listened to understand. He said that in that room, people listened with both ears. It wasn't confidence, it was clarity. Emma stayed for another hour, not to plan legal strategies, but to talk about communication. In a world built on urgency and noise, the greatest skill might just be patience. Not passive patience, active patience, the kind that lets space exist between words so the meaning can rise. She said Chuck reminded her that presence wasn't about taking up space. It was about holding space for others to find their own truth. The next day, something unexpected happened. A former executive from the development company showed up unannounced at the courthouse. He didn't wear a suit. He didn't bring a legal brief. He brought a photo. It was from 1993. Showed Chuck the cottonwood tree and the cross, already weathered by time. He said he had taken the picture himself back when he worked as a county assessor. Said he had forgotten about it until he saw Chuck's face on the news. Said he didn't want to testify, just wanted to add the photo to the record, quietly, no credit needed.
The photo changed something.
The judge reviewed it and added it to the official evidence file. It confirmed that the memorial wasn't new, that it had stood for decades, unclaimed by the world but held firmly in the care of one man. And still, Chuck said little. His calm didn't come from detachment. It came from a purpose. He knew who he was, and he knew why he was there. That kind of clarity is rare. It's not built into training rooms or seminars. It's shaped in silence, in service. In moments where nobody's looking, you do the right thing anyway. When the judge called the court back into session that week, the atmosphere had changed again. It wasn't just respect, it was a reflection. People were beginning to ask questions about their own voices, about how they showed up, not just in court, but in meetings, in families, in conflict, whether they listened to understand or just waited to speak, whether their presence added calm or noise. Chuck didn't tell people what to think. He didn't preach. He just embodied a kind of communication that invited people to rise, to slow down, to say less but mean more. And slowly the story that had started with a land dispute became something else, a quiet masterclass in influence, in humility. What happens when a man doesn't try to be impressive, but simply tries? By Thutra's day, the courthouse felt less like a legal building and more like a classroom. Not the kind with whiteboards and rules, the kind where something real gets taught, whether anyone plans it or not. The case was still open. Technically, there were motions pending, documents under review. But the decision in most people's hearts had already been made. It wasn't just about paperwork, it was about truth, about what kind of behavior deserved protection and what kind of presence deserved to be heard. That morning, Judge Harland opened the hearing with no script, no long introduction, just a pause and then a question. She asked what the courtroom had learned, not just from the evidence, from the man sitting quietly at the front, from the way he had moved through each moment, from the way he had turned down every spotlight and still changed the room. Emma didn't speak. She didn't need to, because the question wasn't legal, it was human. One by one, voices from the gallery began to answer, not planned, not polished, just honest. A man in a worn blazer said he used to interrupt people just to make sure he was heard. After watching Chuck, he decided to start listening again. A woman in her 60s, recently retired from managing a non-profit, said she had forgotten what it looked like when someone led with humility. That reminded her of her father, not for what he said, but for how he carried silence like a shield, not a weapon. Then, a teenager, barely 17, stood up and said he didn't understand most of the legal terms, but he understood that when Chuck looked at people, they stood up straighter. He said that was the kind of influence he wanted when he grew up. Judge Harland let it all happen. She didn't interrupt. She let the space be what it was, a reflection of how quiet character can echo far beyond the walls of any courtroom. Finally, she turned to Chuck. She asked him if there was anything he wished he'd said earlier, anything he regretted not including in his first statement. Chuck paused, then said he had nothing to add. He believed everything worth saying had already been said, and not all of it came from him. She nodded, then said she would issue her final ruling the following Monday. The court adjourned, but nobody moved. Not right away, because something rare had just taken place, a kind of learning that doesn't fit in transcripts, a kind of respect that doesn't depend on agreement, and a kind of influence that leaves people thinking about who they want to be, not just what they want to win. Outside, the air was cooler. The breeze carried leaves across the courthouse steps, and a few people lingered just to feel what it meant to slow down. A man from out of town stood by the cottonwood tree for nearly an hour. He didn't take a picture, he just stood, hat in hand. That weekend, people kept showing up, not in crowds, in pairs, families, solo visits. They brought flowers, letters. Some just came to walk the fence line and leave in silence. Something about the field felt like a mirror, a place where people saw the parts of themselves that didn't get applauded but still mattered most. Emma returned to the farmhouse on Sunday evening. She brought a copy of the news article that ran that morning. The title read, "The Man Who Taught Us Without Trying." She expected Chuck to chuckle, maybe roll his eyes. But instead he looked out the window and said the story was never his alone. It belonged to the land, to the friend he buried, to the people who had spoken up when it would have been easier to sit still. She asked how he felt.
He said he felt the same.
That's the thing about real presence. It doesn't change because people notice it. It just keeps showing up the same way, no matter who's watching. He poured 2 cups of coffee and told Emma he was proud of her. Not for the filings, not for the arguments, for how she had learnt to pause before speaking, for how she had let silence do some of the work. Emma smiled. She said she had learnt more in 1 week watching him than in 5 years of courtroom training. At night, she drove home thinking about stillness, about how rarely it's practiced. How often do people mistake calm for disengaged, quiet for unsure, or restraint for passivity? Chuck had proven the opposite. That week, a man with no microphone and no performance had shifted the way a courtroom felt, the way a town listened, even the way a judge carried herself. And none of it was accidental. It was the result of decades of choosing discipline over ego, integrity over attention, and truth over tactics. Monday morning, the ruling was read. Judge Harlan declared the land legally retained in Chuck's name. She cited the sustained stewardship, the verifiable history, and the collective testimony as grounds for the final decision. But more than that, she added a handwritten note to the official court record. He read, "This case reminded us all that influence can wear boots, carry letters, and never raise its voice. Let this be remembered not just for what was won, but for how it was walked." The crowd didn't erupt. It didn't cheer. It simply stood. Not in celebration, in respect. Chuck shook hands with the bailiff, nodded to the clerk, and tipped his hat to the judge. Then walked out into the sunlight the same way he had walked in, still, steady. No need for words.
Back home, he replaced a loose post on the fence, refilled the water troughs, and fixed a hinge that had been creaking for months. The work never stopped, but something in the air felt settled.
He didn't talk about the ruling. He didn't frame the article. He just folded the judge's note and placed it in the wooden box beside the dog tag and the field map. Then he sat by the porch, looking out at the tree that had held memory longer than any file ever could. And when a small gust of wind blew the edge of a folded letter off the table, he picked it up carefully, smoothed the corner, and said softly, "That'll do." And for once, everything felt quiet, not because there was nothing left to say, but because what had been said would last. When news of the final ruling spread, it didn't arrive like a breaking wave. It moved like rain after a long dry season, gentle, steady, and deeply needed. There were no trending hashtags, no viral outrage, just quiet affirmations passed from hand to hand, from porch to porch. People didn't react with noise, they responded with reflection. That was the real shift. Not in court, in culture. Across the town, people started pausing more often before speaking, not because they were uncertain, because they had seen what clarity looked like when it wasn't rushed. A grocery clerk began asking customers how they were doing and actually waited for the answer. A retired teacher found herself letting her students finish their thoughts without correcting them too soon. Even the local paper changed its editorial tone, trading punchy headlines for thoughtful stories. One issue ran with the cover title, "What We Learned from a Man Who Never Tried to Teach." Chuck never claimed any of it. He kept working. The fence around the memorial field got a new coat of sealant. The path to the cottonwood tree was lined with small stones. Someone left a wooden bench nearby. No plaque, no inscription. Just a place to sit and be still. Emma stopped by more often, not because of legal duties, but because the silence had become a kind of mentorship. She would ask questions, Chuck would answer, sometimes with words, sometimes with pauses, that taught more than explanations ever could. One afternoon she asked how he handled moments when people misunderstood him. He said he used to try to correct them. Then he realized clarity is different from control. Trying to explain too much usually takes away the very thing you're trying to protect. He said the best kind of communication leaves space for people to meet you halfway. That line stayed with her. Later that week she used it in a meeting at her firm. She didn't raise her voice, didn't argue, just let her pause and speak as loudly as she wants. The room listened differently. Meanwhile, something else began unfolding. Calls started coming into local city councils from nearby towns. People were asking questions about land designations, about veteran memorials that had been neglected, about properties left to caretakers without proper documentation. The Chuck Norris case had become a quiet reference point, not for litigation, for integrity.
In a small college in Kansas, a professor used the case in his ethics class. He asked students to describe what made Chuck persuasive. One student said it was because he didn't try to win. He just stood there like the truth would hold him up if he stayed long enough. Another student said Chuck reminded her of her grandfather, who taught her that dignity didn't need grammar to make a point.
And so, the story kept traveling, not by force, by invitation. Back in the county, the judge herself had changed. She didn't admit it publicly, but her staff noticed she asked more questions now. Not legal ones, human ones. She'd started visiting the records department to check filings personally. She paused before making rulings, and once she left her bench, walked out of the courthouse, and stood beside the cottonwood tree for 10 silent minutes. She didn't speak when she returned, but something in her voice was different that afternoon, less clipped, more aware. Chuck didn't ask for updates, he didn't collect reactions. When someone brought him a framed copy of the court ruling, he placed it in a drawer and went back to sanding a barn door. His wife, Mary, asked him if he felt proud. He said he felt steady. There's a difference. That same week, a teacher from a neighboring county brought her class to visit the memorial. Teenagers stood quietly, unsure of what to do at first. Then one of them knelt and placed a small rock at the base of the tree. No words were spoken, but the gesture caught on. By the end of the visit, nearly 20 stones sat beneath the tree. A language of presence. The story didn't stop at local impact. The State Bar Association held a closed-door session on judicial conduct and public perception. Chuck's case was referenced not because of legal irregularity, but because of tone. Judges across the region were encouraged to attend listening workshops, not hearings, workshops. The first skill taught wasn't how to respond, it was how to listen with respect. Chuck's presence had reshaped the idea of leadership without authority, influence without the platform, and that made people ask harder questions of themselves. Leaders began to wonder if they had lost the discipline of pausing. Professionals questioned whether their certainty had outpaced their curiosity. And always, the image returned, a man standing in court, not to perform, not to fight, but to hold space for something true. That fall, a group of law students came to the farm unannounced. They didn't ask for a tour, they just stood by the fence quietly. When Chuck saw them, he didn't walk over right away. He finished tightening a gate, then slowly approached. He asked what brought them. One of them answered, said they were learning about voice, but hadn't found an example that felt real until they read his transcript. Chuck looked at them for a long moment. Then, they said something they had written down, word for word. He said that when your words come from a deep place, you don't have to convince people, you just have to let them land. That was it. Later, they published an article about the visit, not about fame, about influence through quiet depth. The headline read, "A Lesson from the Fence Line." Weeks passed and fall deepened. The wind carried the smell of dry leaves and wood smoke, and the cottonwood tree stood tall against the golden sky. Chuck didn't speak of legacy, but people were building one around him all the same.
Emma had started collecting stories from those who had been moved by the case, not for publication, just to preserve a quiet archive. Letters from teachers, notes from veterans, journal entries from teenagers who had never thought much about communication until they saw a man say, "So little and still move a room."
One note came from a CO in Chicago. He had watched the footage of the hearing on a lunch break and didn't expect to feel anything. But as Chuck stood, unmoved and deliberate, he found himself thinking about his boardroom habits, about how often he'd confused urgency with leadership. He wrote that he had listened to his team more in the past month than in the past 5 years combined. Another letter came from a retired judge in Vermont. She thanked Chuck not for what he said, but for what he refused to say. She wrote that it takes strength to speak, but it takes discipline to wait, and that watching him had reminded her why she took the bench in the first place. One afternoon, Emma read some of these letters to Chuck. He listened without blinking, just sipped his coffee. When she asked how it felt to know he had impacted people he would never meet, he said something simple. It's not about reaching people, it's about being rooted enough that if they come close, they know where they are. That line settled between them like a stone in a river. Solid, quiet, undeniable. Emma nodded and said she might borrow it sometime. Chuck smiled and said that was fine. Just, don't rush it, he added. Let it come to you slowly. Meanwhile, back in town, something unusual happened. The local community center invited Chuck to speak, not on a stage, just to sit in a chair and answer questions. He declined politely, said the answers were already in the field. But he did agree to attend. He sat near the back, sipping tea, while others talked about communication, presence, and influence. He didn't raise his hand, but near the end a teenager asked the group what it meant to lead without speaking. The room went quiet and all eyes turned to Chuck. He paused for a long time, then said this: "If people know you're listening, really listening, they'll carry your silence as if it were your voice." No one said a word after that. The moderator thanked him, and the gathering ended. That sentence would be quoted later in leadership retreats, printed in newsletters, and even posted on a university wall, but Chuck never heard about any of that. He wasn't following the trail, he was still walking it. Autumn gave way to early winter, and the first frost touched the field. The path to the tree remained open. Small stones lined it now, carefully placed by visitors. No one asked who started the tradition. It didn't need credit. It just needed care. Emma came by on a cold morning with news. She had been invited to speak at a national conference on leadership and influence. They wanted her to share insights from the case. She was nervous, unsure what to say.
Chuck told her what he had learned in the military, then relearned on the land. When you're nervous before speaking, it means you still care about the truth more than the impression, and that's the best place to speak from. Emma took that with her. At the conference, she spoke with clarity. No slides, no gimmicks, just stories. About a man who walked into court with a folded letter and changed the atmosphere. About how presence can be more persuasive than power, and about how she learned to listen between sentences, not just inside them. The room gave her a standing ovation, but the one thing she remembered most was a man in the back who approached her quietly afterward and said he hadn't spoken in a meeting for 3 years, but now he might try again. That's how Chuck's voice kept traveling, not through speeches, through permission. He gave people permission to speak slowly, to sit longer with their thoughts, to stand without explanation, and to believe that communication doesn't always require polish. It just requires being fully present when it matters. By the time the first snow came, the memorial field was dusted in white. Visitors still arrived, leaving letters tucked under stones. A boy left his first journal. A widow left a flower and a ribbon from her husband's uniform. A school teacher left a small wooden sign that simply said, "Be still, learn again." Chuck didn't frame any of it. He didn't catalog what people said or left. He just made sure the path stayed clear and the tree remained strong. Because legacy isn't built in monuments, it's built in habits. One day, while mending a fence post, he looked up and saw two men from the development company standing at the edge of the property. They weren't there to challenge anything. They carried a package. Inside was a framed copy of the original survey map, cleaned, restored, preserved behind glass. Alongside it was a note. "We came here to buy land. We were left reminded of what can't be bought." Chuck nodded once and thanked them. Not for the gift, for the respect. The men didn't stay long. They didn't take pictures, just placed the frame in the grass and walked back down the road. That evening, Chuck sat on the porch, holding the frame on his lap. He didn't look at it long, just enough to recognize what it was. Then he set it beside the wooden box, leaned back, and let the cold air press gently against his face. He wasn't thinking about victory or fame. He was thinking about his friend beneath the cottonwood, about how presence outlives noise, and how sometimes the loudest thing a man can say is nothing at all. And that, perhaps, was what the world had remembered. Not just because of Chuck, but because of what he represented. The kind of influence that does not raise its voice.
Because it does not need to. Winter passed quietly. The snow came heavier than expected that year, pressing against fences and softening the corners of the land. Chuck didn't mind. He welcomed the silence that snow brings. It muffled the world just enough to hear yourself think. The path to the cottonwood tree stayed open. Volunteers came to shovel it every few days, never needing to be asked. Some left thermoses of coffee at the gate. A couple of them repaired the latch without saying a word. That was the new language around here, presence without performance. Chuck spent more time in his shop, organizing tools he hadn't touched in years. Mary said it was like watching a man not preparing to leave anything behind, but making sure what remained made sense. He still moved with purpose, still checked on the livestock, but his world had grown even quieter. One morning, Emma stopped by with something wrapped in a brown folder. It was a curriculum packet sent from a state university. They were using Chuck's hearing as part of a communication course. It wasn't about the law, it was about tone, restraint, and how truth works when it's not competing for attention. He read the intro, then closed it and set it aside. She asked if he was proud. He said no, but he was relieved. Relieved that silence could still be recognized as something strong. Maybe people were ready to hear again, not just reply. Emma told him. Students had begun quoting his lines in their presentations, not just repeating them, but building on them. One student rewrote a company handbook to start with a new principle: lead with less, listen with more. Chuck smiled at that, said if even one person changed how they showed up in a meeting, that was enough. He didn't want followers, he wanted fewer people shouting into empty rooms. Around that same time, a leadership consultant from Denver came to visit. She had worked with executives for years, helping them find their voice. She said she'd never seen someone who used theirs so sparingly, but with such impact. Chuck asked her what she thought made someone trustworthy in a room full of voices. She said consistency. He nodded. Then said, presence without consistency is decoration with its influence. She wrote it down. Over the next few weeks, letters kept arriving. A father from Montana wrote that he started sitting with his son in silence each evening before bedtime. SS aide, opening up without question. A nurse from Louisiana shared that she had changed her tone with difficult patients after watching Chuck's hearing. Fewer instructions, more space. The story had turned from event to example, and still, Chuck stayed the same. He added a second coat of paint to the barn door. He replaced an old weather vane. He checked the trail camera near the far gate and smiled at the deer tracks. His world wasn't getting bigger. It was growing deeper. Then came the invitation. A national organization wanted to give Chuck an award for dignity and civic leadership. They offered to fly him to Washington, put him in a hotel, host a ceremony. He turned it down, gently. Said leadership doesn't need plaques, just follow through. They offered to send a film crew instead. He declined that too. He wasn't interested in explaining what had already been shown. But the story kept moving, not fast, but far. At a small high school in Nebraska, the principal printed a quote from the hearing on a banner above the gym. It read, "Speak when it matters, stand when it's time, be steady the rest of the way." A city council in Ohio opened its meetings with 1 minute of silence, inspired by the courtroom pause Chuck had held. They called it the Norris Minute. It reminded them to breathe before making decisions. And at the local library near Chuck's town, a quiet exhibit was set up, not about the case, but about how people listen. The first display held no sound, just a bench, a copy of the folded letter, and a quote printed on glass. "You don't need many words if the few you choose come from something true." Chuck visited once. He didn't stay long. He just stood by the display, read the quote, then left a small stone on the edge of the bench. Same as the others had done at the tree. Never wanted to be a symbol. He only wanted to be real. And that's why the story lasted. People started noticing their own habits. Professionals wrote about how they changed the way they opened meetings. More listening, less posturing. One therapist shared that clients opened up more when she paused after asking a question. She wrote that it felt like she had stopped performing and started holding space. And still, Chuck never once gave a speech. One morning, Emma brought a new visitor to the farm. A young man in his early 30s. He had struggled with stuttering for most of his life and had avoided leadership roles because of it. After watching the courtroom video, he wrote a blog about Chuck's slow cadence, which gave him permission to stop apologizing for how he spoke. Chuck invited him inside. They sat for 2 hours, mostly in silence. When the man left, he hugged Chuck and said he finally understood that clarity wasn't about speed, it was about presence. Chuck didn't reply, just placed a hand on his shoulder. That night, he told Mary, it felt good. Not because he was appreciated, but because the young man had found his own voice. A voice not modeled after Chuck's, but built beside it. That's what real influence does. It doesn't make copies, it calls people back to themselves. As spring approached, the land thawed. The cottonwood trees started to bloom again. Small green buds. New life. Same roots. Emma stopped by with news that she'd been offered a teaching role. A university wanted her to lead a course on values-based communication. She asked Chuck what he thought she should teach first. He said to start with the question, not the answer, and tell them that the first rule of presence is to be comfortable with silence. The room doesn't need you to speak. You need to mean it when you do. She smiled, wrote it down, and promised to send him the syllabus. And that's how Chuck's story ended up in classrooms, not textbooks, in meetings, not manuals. Not because someone broadcast it, but because people needed it. Not for content, for reminder. That is, the way you carry yourself when no one's watching still carries weight when everyone is. At the end of it all, Chuck didn't change the world by raising his voice. He changed it by standing still, speaking calmly, and refusing to trade dignity for attention. That's something many of us forget in a world that moves too fast and talks too loud. We're told to be bold, to speak up, to stand out. But sometimes the real strength is knowing when to stay quiet, when to hold your ground, and when to let your actions do the talking. Chuck reminded us that confidence isn't about volume, it's about clarity. It's not about winning the room, it's about meaning every word when you finally speak. And maybe that's what real leadership is. Not controlling the moment, but grounding it. Not outshining others, but reminding them how to return to themselves. If you've ever felt that your voice was too soft, or that you had to be someone else just to be heard, I hope this story reminded you of your power. The kind that doesn't shout, the kind that doesn't need applause, the kind that lasts. Because influence doesn't come from having the perfect words, it comes from being real enough that people lean in, just to hear what you'll say next. And if Chuck Norris can change a room with just a few steady words, so can you. If this story made you feel something, even quietly, leave a comment and share your thoughts. What moment in your life taught you the power of presence? And if you'd like more stories like this, filled with real lessons and quiet strength, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your presence here matters, and so does your voice.